Thank you so much, Elaine, for the very, very warm welcome. And thank you, Sherry, for the introduction, and Babin for all your organizing behind the scenes. It is an absolute pleasure and honor to be here on traditional and treaty territory for the Mississauga Anishinaabe. And I was just looking over the territorial acknowledgement before my remarks today and noted that it's mentioned that treaties are ongoing commitments and relationships. And that's really what I want to speak to in my presentation today. That sounded pretty impressive. So I'm focusing on the release of a new book that just came out in paperback and should be available at Take Cover Books soon in case you're interested. A fabulous new bookstore just along Hunter Street near the waterway there, as I went to earlier. But this research is based on a postdoctoral project that started in 2012-2013, right when I was finishing my PhD, which was focused on work related to Chemical Valley. But at the same time, I found myself absolutely fascinated by what was going on with the Idle No More movement, as well as former Attawapiskat Chief Theresa Spence's hunger strike or ceremonial fast. And so I'll explain to you today a little bit about what motivated that research, what I found in my discourse analysis, and how I hope that this research can contribute to an ongoing movement towards decolonial futures. I will talk a little bit about sensing policy. I know Elaine's excited about that approach and concept. And I also will talk a little bit about the power of arts that I think are so inspiring for thinking alternatively about the status quo. So this image you see here, this is the image of the book cover, and so it's women, and I'm not sure if you can see here, but the sign that one of the women's holding up says, "Remember Canada, you are a treaty partner." And that sign for me is so symbolic of the key conversation and message that this work contributes to. And I think this is a really powerful image because there are women dancing. So there's this joyful assembly in the foreground of Parliament, which is looming behind, which I would argue has a long way to go to uphold its commitment to democracy. So I will be focusing on the connection between environmental justice, treaty relations, and artistic movements with an emphasis on storytelling today. And one of the questions that I really want us to take up together, hopefully in the Q&A, is how can decision makers hear stories for transformative alternatives, for transformative policy? I teach in public administration right now, and I'm often telling my students it's important to look at statistics and data of a certain kind, but we also need stories. And I'm inspired by the words of my really good friend and colleague, Lindsay Kijita-Burrows, who wrote the foreword to my book, who says, when governments make decisions that don't account for stories, people suffer. And I think that's a really important message. So you might be wondering a little bit about who I am, what's my story. So I'm a Canadian non-Indigenous citizen. I grew up on the west coast of Canada on unceded Tsleil-Waututh territory, which is a region you may have heard of for the terminus of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. So I grew up facing the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And so a lot of my interest in Indigenous mobilization has been oriented around this geography and this territory where I was raised, but without a lot of education or understanding of the Tsleil-Waututh people whose waters and territories I grew up on. So I did my bachelor's and master's in political science at the University of Victoria, left to Anishinaabe and Algonquin territories, where I completed my PhD at the University of Ottawa, returned to the West Coast to start my teaching and research career, went to the University of Hawaii for a few years, and came back. And now I've been working at the University of Victoria since the end of 2020. So it's really become home for me, where I live, work, and play on unceded Lekwungen territory. So my areas of expertise are political ecology, environmental political theory, environmental sustainability, and community development. So in our School of Public Administration, we have a traditional sort of MPA program, but we also have a community development program. So I mostly teach in the community development program, but right now I'm teaching a course on government and governance to MPA students, and they're really interested in these questions that I'm raising about, what does it mean to be in a treaty relation today, and how can policymakers hear stories and take stories as evidence, as testimony, as kinds of truths that can inform decision making. So I'm really hopeful that while I'm passionate about political theory and trained as a political theorist, that this can be really applied and practical and useful as well to those in decision-making sites of power. Elaine did a really nice and generous job of overviewing some of the contents of the everyday exposure work and project. And so for those of you who may or may not be familiar, Chemical Valley is an area located at the southernmost point of Lake Huron, where there's an area known as Chemical Valley with petrochemical and polymer refineries that completely surround the Attawapiskat Nation. And as a result, there are a lot of environmental, reproductive justice, health concerns there. And that was the focus of my PhD research. But right when I was finishing that up in 2012, 2013, that was when Idle No More was really taking off. And that led me to this second project here, Life Against States of Emergency. So this is the book cover, Life Against States of Emergency. And the focus that I really want to emphasize today is around treaty relations and what does it mean to be in a treaty relation. So what drew me to this was witnessing a lot of the mobilization by young people in Attawapiskat. So Attawapiskat is a small reserve located about 7 kilometers south of the city of Sarnia, and there were young people who were organizing, protesting, blockading rail lines, holding signs in solidarity with Attawapiskat Chief Theresa Spence, and I found myself just captivated, glued to the media, really curious about the way in which the media portrayed and represented Chief Spence and her community. And of course, the mobilization for Attawapiskat Chief Theresa Spence was parallel to and not the same as Idle No More. And what had been motivating Theresa Spence was concerns around infrastructure concerns such as housing in her community. So I was really struck by the way in which young people, like this woman pictured here, holding up this sign that says, Chief Spence is my hero, that kind of solidarity and organizing was taking place in Attawapiskat while Theresa Spence held camp at Victoria Island just outside of Parliament. So the goal of this project is really about raising awareness about what I think was the missing narrative in the media coverage of her fast, which was about treaty relations. So there's a lot of media coverage about the crisis narrative, about the blame narrative, about the accountability narrative. But she was really asking Canadians to take seriously what it means to be in a treaty relation today. And I think that question has a lot of significance here, where there have been recent treaties, and it also has a lot of significance in British Columbia, where there's ongoing treaty relations. And as I'll mention in a moment, Theresa Spence is from Treaty 9 territory, and so she had really specific beliefs about how treaty relations could be improved and were not going the way that she would want to see in accordance with her customary practices, perspectives, and values as an Indigenous female leader. So the way that I approached answering this question of what does it mean to be in a treaty relation initially started with my political theory training, wanting to do a discourse analysis. I didn't want to bother anybody. I thought I would just, go to the archives, look at Hansard transcripts, look at media coverage. So that was my starting point. Look at, I had 2 keywords, Attawapiskat and Treaty 9, and I looked up every kind of mainstream source of media coverage and began my discourse analysis. And then I thought I'll just, do one interview with Theresa Spence, and that will kind of complete the discourse analysis, and I'll be done my little postdoc project. But upon meeting with Theresa, she had a different plan for me, and that was to work with youth in her community. And I was very nervous. I don't have a lot of training working with youth or doing the kind of creative arts-based research that she was hoping that I would do. But that's what happens when you do community-based research. You listen, you adjust, and you shift. And I felt like she was sort of calling me to be accountable to what would be useful to her. And she said, Attawapiskat is always depicted in this very dark and gloomy light, and we need to tell different stories. So she kind of called me in to support the work that she was advocating for her community, for her youth, which led to the Reimagining Attawapiskat project, which I will talk about today. So Chief Spence's story. So this project really emerged out of her story, seeing someone who was being so vulnerable, who was putting themselves forward, who was portrayed in this very negative light in a lot of ways by mainstream media coverage, And I was just so compelled with the ignorance, which came across in political debates, in media coverage, perpetuating this crisis narrative. And I think that's really troubling when the narrative, centers that gloomy sort of cast, that shadow over the community without celebrating the strength, the culture, the connection to place, which many community members are so proud of. So I really wanted to do justice as best I could to Theresa Spence's story and try to find out, what was motivating her to engage in her ceremonial fast in her own words, on her own terms, rather than how it was depicted in the media. So with her permission, I've included some of the images in the book and on a website that accompanies it. I asked her, what's your favorite image from the media coverage? And this is her favorite image, so I share it here with her consent and permission. Because it shows her strength, and she's, sort of a soft-spoken leader. I ask if she wants to join me in these kinds of speaking engagements, and she doesn't really love a lot of media attention for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure you can appreciate. But I am hopeful that when she has time and interest and availability, she'll be up here, joining me and sharing these stories. But she has shared with me that it means a lot to her to know that she doesn't carry the burden of always having to tell these stories. And so I feel like it's that ethic of care and that mutual aid, that reciprocity that I bring to doing this kind of work. So something that she said to me very early on in one of our first interviews, once I managed to track her down, it took a long time to get her attention. I had to sort of prove myself. But once we sat down over breakfast at the Bon Air Motel in Timmins, Ontario, is where we first had our interview, she said to me, "Sarah, you're treaty 2. This is why you have to do this work." And I hadn't really thought of myself as a treaty person before. It is something that we talk about in British Columbia, but it's not something that ever really hit home for me, what that means kind of personally and professionally. And so it's something that we talked about quite a bit during our first interview, and then something that we talked about again and again when we spoke over the phone or met again in person. And what I've come to appreciate is that what it means to be in a treaty relation is that it is both a personal commitment and a professional practice. And so it is about ethics of relationship building, reciprocity, care, and a kind of iterative, ongoing relationship and commitment. And I think this is very different than conventional understandings of treaty relations. And so a lot of the book kind of maps out 3 sort of perspectives of treaties, including a kind of surrender narrative, secession narrative, the contract narrative, the sharing narrative, and tries to center a more of a sovereignty approach as well. So those narratives are mapped out in the book. But one of the key points that I want to highlight here is that she explained to me that treaties should apply to all kinds of processes and practices. So it should apply to interpretations of Treaty 9, but also things like impact benefit agreements. So for those of you who may or may not be familiar, impact benefit agreements relate to often private contracts between corporations and communities, as was the case with respect to the De Beers diamond mine in the community. And Theresa Spence explained to me from her perspective, a treaty relation would mean that you revisit that agreement, that it's not just a one-off, a closed deal. And several times leadership from Attawapiskat mobilized, organized, blockaded access points to the mine. And the goal of that action was to say, we want to reopen the impact benefit agreement. We're not benefiting. We're experiencing impacts. They're often harmful in terms of the environment. And we want to revisit this relationship. But that kind of closed door relationship was really frustrating Theresa and other leaders in the community. So you are treaty 2. I feel like it's a call to action, perhaps one that all of us can relate to in some way. So research questions. Academics love to know, what are your research questions? So the main one is, it is practical, but it's also very theoretical. What does it mean to be in a treaty relationship today? And I think that's the question that Theresa Spence was posing to Canadians during the height of I Don't Know More movement, during her fast, and that the book responds to. Not that it necessarily answers, but that it certainly tries to contribute to an ongoing conversation about. And then second, how did mainstream representations of Chief Theresa Spence frame her fast? So again, the book maps out those discourses of crisis, accountability, and blame, and instead tries to center stories from the community. And then the most exciting question, perhaps, what do alternative decolonial sustainable futures grounded in Attawapiskat community perspectives look like? And this is where I think the power of storytelling and the arts come in, as community members so generously shared their art, their culture, their music, their song, their drumming with me and with others, as we'll see in a moment with the online gallery. So I'm also really inspired by the work of Anishinaabe legal scholar Amy Craft, and this is a really fabulous children's book. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it yet, but I highly recommend it. Hopefully it'll come into Take Cover Books or other local bookstore series. It's a really small book. I'm often gifting it to people. I'll just give you a minute to read the words here, and then I want to highlight a few of the concepts I think that really speak to what it means to think about yourself as a treaty person, as somebody engaged in these ongoing iterative relationships. And so I should note that while Amy Craft is an Anishinaabe legal scholar, I think there's a lot in this quote that relates to how we can think in broader terms about treaty relations. So while Amy Craft has written quite a bit about the sharing narrative, there are other narratives as well around kind of sovereignty, but one of the main points to sort of intervene on and challenge is this idea of a treaty as simply a land sale, as simply a contract, or simply a secession agreement. Rather, a treaty is alive, it's ongoing, it's abundant, it's something that needs to be restored. So the idea of renewal is one that I want to highlight here that comes up. Relationships and responsibilities. I think those are, they might sound like simple concepts, but they're, I think, at the same time very profound and meaningful when we think about iterative, ongoing, fluid relationships. So in order to understand kind of the complexity of this story of what motivated Theresa Spence, I think it's important to spend a few minutes looking at Treaty 9 as well as the state of emergency declarations that led up to her high-profile fast, as well as the state of emergency declarations that have persisted since. So this is where I get to use the clicker. So Treaty 9, this is a map that was provided to me through Library and Archives Canada. Side note for researchers, it's always wonderful to cultivate good relationships with archivists who can help you get access to material when you're trying to do that from afar. So this is a map here of Northern Ontario of Treaty 9. So Attawapiskat is right over here on the west coast of, on the west of this map, but along the shore line of James Bay. So you can see here it's in kind of subarctic territory. Hudson Bay is up here, and Attawapiskat is a small community down here. So Treaty 9 is technically the treaty that governs this area for Attawapiskat, and Attawapiskat became party to this treaty through adhesions in the early 1900s, but the initial Treaty 9 was signed in 1905. And what was unique about this treaty is that it was signed by federal officials as well as provincial officials as well. Another aspect that I want to spend a minute talking about is this democratic paradox. And I mentioned this in passing earlier. I've been very obsessed with the symbol of the mace. So I will spend a moment talking about that because, as you may or may not know, Attawapiskat territory has also been home to the De Beers diamond mine for many years, and the impact-benefit agreement that I referenced earlier has often been a source of contention for the community. So here's the mace, and let me tell you why this is symbolic and interesting and troubling all at the same time. So as we're in a parliamentary tradition here in Canada, we've inherited a lot of customary practices in our democratic institutions from the British system, one of them being the mace that is paraded into the legislative chamber to convene democratic deliberation. So a mace is a medieval artifact. It's used to bludgeon one's enemy. It's very violent, but yet we proudly parade it in to say, look at us, aren't we wonderful democratic subjects and beings? I think there's layers and layers of violence here in this object that are worth interrogating and looking at with some hesitation. So this particular mace, this is on display here in the corridor at Queen's Park, and it's adorned with De Beers diamonds. So these diamonds are from Attawapiskat territory, and again, they're extracted with quasi-consent. There was the impact benefit agreement signed. Not everybody agreed to that. There have been a lot of concerns with sewage buildup, all kinds of infrastructure concerns, environmental concerns. The De Beers mine did employ some members from Attawapiskat over the years, but leadership constantly raised concerns about their dissatisfaction with being so close to the diamond mine and feeling that they were not benefiting. And given the prosperity of the mine and the inequity and the housing conditions in the community, there's a disparity there in terms of wealth and prosperity in the region. And so the De Beers diamond mine was about 90 kilometers west of the reserve, the Attawapiskat Reserve, but in their traditional territory. So here we proudly parade. Let the diamonds alone. I think there's a really troubling artifact here that we parade in so proudly. It's this beautiful, spectacular, gold-adorned object that symbolizes violence, and then it's laden with these diamonds that are extracted that look glamorous, but they're not exactly, I think, representative of the kind of inclusive democratic culture that we could aspire to. So there's a lot of room for interrogation when we look at something like the mace. I can't look at a mace the same way now. I was in question period in Ottawa a few days ago, and there was the mace, and I just thought it's so strange that we celebrate this violent object in our democracy. All right, so these are some contextual pieces. There's one more that I want to focus on before we move on. States of emergency. So, as you may likely well know from a lot of the high-profile media coverage, there have been numerous state of emergency declarations in Attawapiskat, and they range from contamination to De Beers sewage disposal, to flooding, to the housing crisis, to youth mental health, and to most recently, poor water quality. So there's a pattern here of state of emergency declarations, and I've come to think of a state of emergency in two different ways, one as a cry for help to receive support from other jurisdictions, or as an executive decision to sort of mask democracy. So I think we need to look at state of emergency declarations with a very critical kind of democratic lens for a variety of reasons. In this case, I think sort of cry for help after cry for help shows a pattern of neglect, shows a pattern of environmental injustice here. The image you see here is of Adrian Sutherland. So on a more hopeful note, he is an inspiring community leader and musician. He's the lead singer of a band called Midnight Shine. And he's somebody that I met in the community and also met outside of the community when he was on tour. He very kindly agreed to an interview. So I interviewed him when he was on tour in 2018 at the Port Theatre in Nanaimo. I drove up from Victoria and watched his show and then sat down with him for an interview. And I wrote about it in the book, and it was going to be the conclusion. I thought I'll just conclude with this sort of really powerful interview and message about arts and movement and moving forward. And then my peer reviewer said, that's the best chapter. It has to be chapter 1. And so I thought, oh no, every chapter is going to have to beat that. I don't know how I'm going to do this. But I ended up moving chapter 7 to chapter 1. So if you only read one chapter, read chapter 1. It's the best chapter. And you'll hear Adrian's story. I sincerely think it is one of the more exciting kind of chapters in the book. Oh, sorry. And the reason why he's wearing this mask is this is pre-COVID. He's trying to, this is a selfie he posted on Twitter, trying to raise awareness about the water quality issue, saying, you know, we can't breathe, we can't live, we're struggling here in Attawapiskat, and we're not receiving any support. We can't drink water from our taps. Our water is tainted. And certainly every time I visited the community, we had to walk to a central water distribution center. I was told not to shower for very long. So there are a lot of ongoing concerns with water. And also, I should mention that he's writing his own memoir. So I'm really excited for that to come out and would highly recommend everyone stay tuned for that as well. And He also reviewed, I'm losing my voice. He reviewed chapter 1, so the chapter about artistic movements for decolonial futures. He reviewed it several times, and we had conversations about it. And I think that kind of collaborative process is really important as well when doing this community engaged writing and research. I'm going to take a long sip of water now. It's probably convenient that my voice is dying when we're going to talk about community voices, so others can have some airtime and floor time here. So this is the most exciting part, I think. Well, I love theory and discourse analysis and critiquing democracy and thinking reflectively about states of emergency. I think the practice of this and the kind of craft that I really want to emphasize and gesture towards that more hopeful aspect is through co-creation and through centering community voices in these stories. So, as mentioned earlier, I teach in a community development program. I'm very inspired by a variety of scholars, but one is Bell Hooks, who talks about learning about love in community. And earlier I was chatting over dinner about how can we fix democracy, and I kind of came back to a few words like care. We need more caring relations. And it might sound simple, but less hierarchical relations, more caring ones connected to community. Another author who I highly recommend to everybody is Dr. Sasha Costanza-Schock. So they've written a book about design justice, and it's fabulous. It talks about co-creation, participatory action research, about co-design. It's focused mostly on technology studies, but I think it's very applicable to community engaged research and also to policy studies. And I said that to a room of about 100 civil servants, and they all stared at me, but I'm hopeful that someday there will be an uptake on co-creation and working with communities and narrative forms of storytelling rather than just making decisions based on sort of quantitative-based models and data. I am hopeful, and I feel like this kind of approach is how we can move in that direction. Another quote that gets me kind of excited is the work by Dr. Ilana Katapan and some of her co-authors who've contributed to a book called Creating Spaces of Engagement. And in the conclusion of their chapter, they talk about radical policy futures, and they don't really define it, they don't really explain it, except to note that it's about a critique of hierarchical power relations. And so I feel like those of us who are political theorists that apply our practice in policy studies or media studies or other kind of concrete examples or ways of contributing to alternative modes of thinking and being in the world, I think this idea of radical policy futures is really helpful. And underlying that is a kind of intervention on conventional hierarchical ways of governing and being. And so I really like this idea of radical policy futures, and it does influence the way that I think about politics and democracy and governance. So how do we move towards these more horizontal modes of governing and being? And again, this is where I find so much power from community. So this is an image taken by one of the youth who participated in the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. So I'm going to next show some of the images that came through that project, which is the project sparked by Theresa Spence when she said, "You're treated to, you have obligations. I'd like to see you do research this way, less about you and your story and your critique and analysis and more about the voices of our community members." So that started with a workshop. So I went in and did a workshop on critical media studies, had national news coverage and all kinds of activities, and it didn't really work. No one was super interested in rewatching, national news anchors talk about their community in such a sort of damage-centered way. And so we just stopped the workshop and instead made space for sharing and seeing the work that young people had already done. So we kind of flipped the workshop format around instead of focusing on, what we, by this time I had worked with a team, including the art teacher and other Indigenous artists, had come to do these workshops and just started listening. So it was a really humbling moment where we thought, we had all this material prepared, but actually what we need to do is already see what amazing talent and stories the young people have in the community. So we went around and gathered images and artworks and songs that community members themselves wanted to share, and that's how the Reimagining Attawapiskat project started. So this is just one image from one of the participants. So this is Jack Linklater Jr., who's featured here. This is the high school art class in Amjanong. So I spent a lot of time in this art class. So I primarily worked with the senior art class in the community. At the time, Jack was a student. Now he sits on their band council, which is so amazing to see. And he shared a lot of his knowledge with our research team about drumming, about art, about sport, about governance leadership. If we have time, I will share a video where he offers some messages. But part of what the young people produced, in addition to a gallery of their artworks, was digital stories. So that's also on our Reimagining Attawapiskat website. And so I will show at least one of those stories in this presentation. So in case you're wondering what sort of influenced my methodological approach to this research, I certainly self-identify as a critical policy studies scholar, one who brings intersectional and interpretive analysis to my research. I'm very fascinated by language, meaning, discourse. I would say that more recently, I've turned in a much more applied direction. So whereas I used to be very persuaded by the works of Michel Foucault and others, I now am more increasingly interested in not just frames of reference, but also reframing and alternative narratives and co-creation. So this has led to kind of arts-based participatory research, working with young leaders like Jack and others to co-create narratives that can be interventions to broader spaces of policy and governance and deliberation. Someone I met along the way who was very pivotal is a woman named Rosie Christachin. So you see Rosie here dancing by the Attawapiskat River. And Rosie was the first person I actually met when I landed in Attawapiskat. There's two ways primarily into the community. One is flying in, one is driving through an ice road. Because it was summer, when I first arrived, I flew in, and from Victoria that required going through Toronto and Timmins and then landing in Attawapiskat. And so Rosie met me at the airport, and we had spoken on the phone. She invited me, and she said, if you want to do good research, you need to come here without an agenda, without your questions. You need to figure that all out from this place, from our community. And we're going to put you to work. Those were kind of the messages she gave to me. And I was introduced to her as a community leader, as someone that I should meet. You have to meet Rosie. So she was certainly a key person in my journey there. And so she put me to work by volunteering at the powwow, the summer powwow, helping with food prep. And basically, I was her personal assistant. And she introduced me to people along the way, including the high school art teacher, who then I began a partnership with, along with the school board, after getting consent from the chief and council. So this is a key point here, listening to community voices. How do we do that as political theorists, as policymakers, as researchers, as students, as elected officials? Listening. I really want to spend some time thinking about and fleshing out what it means to listen. What does radical listening look like? And I don't necessarily have an answer, but I do think it's really important to do this work with humility, with an openness to listening to different perspectives. And I know in terms of our institutions, we have lots of opportunities for hearings, for testimonies, but I am not convinced that there are a lot of meaningful spaces of listening. I worked on a short film called To Fish As Formerly, and it was showed as oral evidence before the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan Pipeline Expansion Project. And so that was interesting to see how stories and film can be interventions, but it was quiet in the room after. There was no give and take, there was no discussion, there was no transformation. So I'm really curious about what does it mean to actually listen to stories and transform power and decision making. So I am really hopeful about artistic movements as spaces of intervention, as contributing to discussion, to discourse and dialogues and changing hierarchical systems. But that requires a lot of transformation on the part of our systems that are inherently hierarchical. So how do we move towards that radical listening is the question that I want to linger and that I want us to think about together, because I'm struggling with this question myself. So back to the community stories. So this is another young woman who I met in community, Keisha Rose Paul Martin. So Keisha was a research assistant for the Reimagining Attawapiskat project, and that's a really important piece of this. When doing community-engaged research, I've learned along the way that it's really, really important to reallocate the resources that we have access to in universities to communities. So that can be things like hiring research assistants, buying equipment, leaving it in the community, funding food for community events, asking communities what they need, what's useful. So Keisha was hired to work with us, and we will close the presentation with one of her narratives, one of her stories about living in Attawapiskat and the strength of her land and the sense of home that's so vital for her. So reframing. I've mentioned a few times now the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. So we have a website. It's reimaginingattawapiskat.com. There's different pages on the website. This is just a screenshot from the postcard project. So this was the very first stage of the Reimagining Attawapiskat project, where we threw away the critical media studies workshop that wasn't what anybody wanted to participate in, and instead went around and shared and gathered the beauty and the art that young people already had. So we put them on a gallery, and so if you go to this website, you can see the name of the author. And then coincidentally, during the time of this workshop, there was an inner city soccer boys team from Toronto there doing a sports-based cultural exchange. And so we printed off postcards and wrote messages and sent them home with the boys soccer team, so they would kind of take these messages and carry them back to Toronto. And it was interesting participating in a sweat in the community and afterwards reflecting as a group. And some of the young boys from the soccer team were saying things, profound about their learning, like, oh, I feel like I'm leaving with so much more than I'm actually giving, because they thought they were coming there to sort of train young people about soccer. But I think they really felt transformed and learned a lot by being there. So I promised that I would talk about sensing policy, and here's a good moment to kind of just mention, what I mean when I think about sensing policy. And I think that for me, sensing policy goes beyond hierarchical ways of decision making, and it's more about experience, connection. So if, high-level bureaucrats could go to communities, could learn, if they were invited to participate in ceremonies, swim in the river, feel a place, I think it would create a much more profound connection and understanding and way of knowing. And of course that requires a lot of invitation and protocol and safety, but it really requires going beyond, for academics, beyond our cubicles and offices and laboratories, or for civil servants beyond their boardrooms, beyond Zoom, and making relationships to people and places. Certainly for me, being in Attawapiskat, volunteering at the powwow, swimming in the river, participating in ceremony, these were all ways of profound learning for me. And from what I witnessed, they were profound learning opportunities for others who were invited as well. And so sensing policy, whether that's going to a community, being invited into ceremony, or doing something like a toxic tour in Chemical Valley, these are really important. So also on the website are digital stories. Many of you may or may not be familiar with digital stories. I teach digital storytelling in my classes, whether it's public admin or community development or social justice. Essentially, young people create a narrative and then pair it with visuals to tell a story in about 3 to 5 minutes. So we were able to have some funding through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And so we could hire some Indigenous and non-Indigenous filmmakers to come to Attawapiskat for a subsequent visit, where we co-produced digital stories with young people like Keisha and Jack, who I've mentioned, to basically share a different side of what life is like in Attawapiskat than the mainstream media depictions. So they're also on our website. And we refer to this approach as mixed media storytelling. So this approach is primarily threefold. It involves, in my mind anyway, the first phase of, what's the problem? So the problem are these crisis narratives, these blame narratives, these accountability narratives that can be harmful, that lack the geopolitical context, that lack that substance, that lack the colonial understanding, and sort of challenge those frames. That's the first part. And then the second is co-creating. So amplifying the voices of those who are not often depicted in the mainstream media or political discursive representations. And the method that we did that through was arts-based, such as the postcard project and digital storytelling, for example. And then the third sort of phase, not that they have to be linear or sequential necessarily, but the third aspect is the intervention. And so that's where I think, sharing the stories, sharing the gallery, sharing the messages of young people, sharing Theresa's story with her permission and consent is a kind of intervention to speak back, to say there's much more to the story than what has been depicted in mainstream, predominant hegemonic accounts. So that could look like an online gallery. It can look like an exhibition space. Hopefully we will do at some point a physical exhibition and gallery. For now, it's an online one. Really trying to share the voices and perspectives of young people who live in this place with wider audiences. So the image on the right, this is another image from the postcard project, and it's one that almost was going to be on the book cover. I love this one because it's three young people on the river looking forward, and I think it's a beautiful, calming image, one that does speak to the beauty and strength of this place, taken by a young person, Geraldine Matinas, who participated in the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. So what were some of the messages that came out in the stories and through this work? One, if we come back to the idea of treaty relations, is this notion that treaties are alive. They're not just pieces of paper. They're not simply archival documents. They're not just contracts or land secession agreements, but they're alive. They're vibrant. They're full of meaning. They can be enacted through song and dance and music of various forms. And I also think they emerge through showing the beauty of place. So whether that's looking at the river or different cultural practices, highlighting, colors beyond the gray and the doom and gloom depictions, thinking about dance again and strength and connection to place and the beauty, the colors. And this is an image, this one here I took. I was so taken by the tamarack trees, how they turn gold. And you often wouldn't see these kinds of colorful images in the media. When you Google Attawapiskat, often what comes up are kind of the gray roads, the stray dogs, the derelict housing. And I think it is really important to center beauty as well. And I feel like in all the work that I do, I'm often trying to strive a kind of balance that's almost an impossible balance, but one we're striving for nonetheless between light and shadow. So shadows being the kind of critique of colonialism, and then the light being the celebration of culture and creativity and strength. So moving towards environmental justice and how is this connected to treaties and environmental justice. So similarly, I think it's through a kind of vibrancy. It's through recognizing that treaties are alive. There's kind of a life-giving intergenerational quality here. This is Rosie, again, with young people around the drum during a ceremony. And I love that the young woman's shirt says good vibes, really trying to create life and energy and momentum through artistic practices, cultural practices. Again, like drumming is such an important part of the community and culture. Environmental justice also being about recognizing the sovereignty of this place, the self-determination of Attawapiskat, listening to what Theresa Spence is asking for when looking for an ongoing, revitalized relationship of Treaty 9 or treaty relations in general. Centering human and more than human relations in these conversations is really important. I know that Lindsay Burrows at Queen's is writing about Indigenous constitutionalisms, and in her writing, she's thinking about responsibilities to environments, to more than human beings as well. And I think that's a really important aspect of the kind of futures orientation for environmental justice, for treaty relations, for Indigenous political theory. And so finally, this is Rosie looking forward across the river. This is one of the last pictures in the book. It's a still shot from a film called After the Last River. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend a variety of films, actually. So Alanis Abomsawin has worked on several films based in Attawapiskat, one being Trick or Treaty, which is really powerful. Victoria Lean has also worked on After the Last River, and so with her permission, I included a few of the images from her film. And so this is one that I did a little digital rendering from, trying to be all creative, and that kind of, I like the sort of strength of Rosie, how she's looking forward, she's interrupting the Canadian flag and showing her strength. So this brings me towards the end, where I would really like to share with you one of the digital stories. If there's time in the Q&A, I can show another one. The two that I feel most kind of compelled by are Jack Linklater Jr.'s story, where he talks about his connection to the environment and the teachings of the trees in the river. And this one is Keisha's story, where I'll let her speak for herself, but she's sharing about the beauty and the groundedness she feels in relation to her home. So we'll watch this, and then I will conclude.
In my backyard, one of my favorite places. There's a lot of green during the summer times. It just looks so pretty, like different types of greens, and like you can just come out here and like walk around, or you know, like a campfire in your backyard or something. It's just, you have all these colors in the fall, and come out here to take photos sometimes. I don't know, photos are like kind of a big part of this town, because like a lot of people take photos here, like especially when it snows or something, and then while it's like snowing there will be a sunset, so like it looks really pretty. And I don't know, it's just, I feel like photography is like, it makes people feel better, even if they're not professionals at it. Like they'll just take a photo and be like, capture like a really beautiful moment, and they can just look at it, and like it can make them feel better, I think. And like it's also showing outsiders that it's not all like ugly here, I guess I should say, because they have like a lot of like not nice photos on the internet of Attawapiskat, and there's not many really nice photos on the internet of Attawapiskat except for the Reimagining Attawapiskat project. We have some really beautiful spots in this town, and like it's not all ugly, and it can be really beautiful, and you can have a good time here. Like here you can go for walks and like in the bush, and like you can go like tea picking, the tundra tea leaves, you can go pick those, and like you can go pick berries, and you can go fishing anytime you want. You just have to like walk out to the rapids, and like all this nature and all the beauty around the community, in the community. Even the people here are like really great too. And they don't really see much of that on the news or like on the internet. They don't really cover that. They just want to cover all the negativity with the suicide crisis and whatnot, and like it's not always like that here. While the whole community is together, like you just have a good time, you do the activities, or you just sit around and socialize, and like it's fun. People are laughing, they're smiling, and it's just really nice. Like, I don't know, yeah, it's home.
Yeah, and what I find so powerful about her story is she acknowledges the challenges related to the suicide crisis, for instance, and right around that time, but right before I had visited for this workshop, there was the state of emergency due to the suicide crisis, and we were fortunate to get funding to do this project. And so I returned shortly after that had happened, and so it was definitely fresh on everyone's hearts and minds. But again, it's so beautiful to hear her words and see how much strength she draws from her home in this place. And she speaks, I think, about the purpose of the Reimagining Attawapiskat project and how it's trying to be an intervention on the mainstream depictions of her community and her home. So I'm going to skip over these. This is more the teacher and me with the prepared discussion questions. I look forward to seeing the questions that you have for us. Please do stay in touch. This is my contact information. I'm part of the Feminist Environmental Research Network. It's a listserv and a network. You're welcome to join it. For further reading or listening, I was recently on a podcast called Pretty Heady Stuff. So I talk a little bit more about connecting my thinking around states of emergency and crisis with the climate emergency. That's a new area of my thinking and work at the moment. And then even more reading. This book I picked up recently, The Compassionate Imagination. I liked it because there was heart on it, and it talks all about the power of the arts for democracy. And so I'm trying to get everyone in my department to read it. So I'm recommending it here as well. I think it would make for more compassionate civil servants. So worth recommending. And that's it. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.